Hey guys, Work here. If you look back at my channel, you'll see a video about an Anderson lower kit that I purchased with some questionably machined parts on it. This video is just going to be a video about me fixing the components so that they function a little bit better. Again, one of the problems is a casting mark on the front face of the trigger, a double scallop on the hammer. So the first thing that I'm going to do is work on the sear surfaces of the hammer and the trigger. We've got this casting mark on the trigger that needs cleaned up, and on the hammer it just needs sharpened a little bit. I got my sharpening stones here that I got for super cheap off of a China website. We're going to start with a relatively rough grit to get down to this casting point, and then we're going to work our way up to get to a nice, clean, smooth surface to give the hammer a nice surface to slide on. Let's start with a 180 grit. I just used some cheap hops oil in order to lubricate. I'm going to put down a paper towel to keep things on my workbench relatively clean. On the trigger, you can see that it has this angle here, and that angle needs to be maintained. Without that angle, there's a possibility of the sear surface on the hammer sliding off of the surface on the trigger, which would cause a misfire. So, in trying to keep that angle relatively true, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a Sharpie. I would rather black, but I don't have a black one right now. We're going to color this surface and let it dry. This will give us a good idea of how much we're grinding and how straight we're getting and how true to the original shape we're getting. So you can see after one pass I'm sticking a little bit too far to this top edge. I need to level it off a little and even up my pressure. After a couple more passes, I can see that my pressure is better, my coverage is better, and I can see that there's a low spot in the middle, and that I'm hitting the high spots on the edges. We want to even as much of this out as we can, and then we'll polish the top here to give this edge a nice sharp surface so that the break between the trigger and the hammer is nice and crisp. I think that's about all I'm going to be able to get rid of that casting mark, so we're going to go ahead and move on to a finer grit to start cleaning this up and making it smoother. Let's skip up a couple of steps to an 800. I'm going to remark this so that I can tell if my 800 steps are being even or not. Okay, that's pretty good for the 800. Let's move on. On the 1500, I'm going to start breaking this top edge here to get rid of any burr that's been created. I'm going to step up to the 3000 grit. These higher grit ones seem to be a little bit thirstier for oil than the lower grit ones do. So I'm going to put a little extra on this one. Try to get it worked in before I start using it. Okay, that's it for the trigger. I've cleaned this area up, kept the original angle, made sure that there wasn't a burr up here, but this is a nice sharp edge now. Now we'll move on to the hammer. So the hammer, I'm just going to polish this section up slightly. It doesn't need a whole lot of work, but we're going to go ahead and clean that up. We're going to take down this scallop in here to make this clean disconnect ledge. Okay, so I did something similar here to the hammer. I just cleaned up this edge a little bit, made sure that this is a nice sharp edge so that when they catch here, it's a nice clean break when you pull the trigger down. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of these scallops. To do this, I need to file down that and then clean it up a little bit with some fine grit sand. So to do this, I'm just going to use a jeweler's file I'm going to get in here. I'm going to clean this out right here, trying to keep the same contour that the hammer is already formed in. Okay, so now I've gotten rid of that scallop. Now I need to get some fine grit sandpaper to clean up the inside there. This is just automotive 1000 grit sandpaper. I find it works extremely well to polish up surfaces, especially around contoured surfaces like this. So there it is, a near mirror finish. Go ahead and toss some oil on here just to get it a little bit smoother. And there we go, nice cleaned up disengage. So let's toss this thing in a lower and see what it does now. Okay, so there's the hammer inside. So there's our trigger pull. It's still relatively heavy. This is not a light trigger. You get a little bit of creep and then a clean break. To get much cleaner than that, I would have to reduce the amount of area that the sears overlap, and for this firearm I just don't want to do that. So it's a new day. We're back at the trigger job. So you can see we've improved the movement of the trigger quite a bit. Slight creep and a relatively clean break. Again, this trigger is slightly heavy, but that's alright. The problem now is the disengage lever not completely disengaging. So you can see I just reset the trigger on the disengage, and if I lightly let up, the disengage will not let go. Okay, that scalloped area that we need to clean up a little bit more. So let's go ahead and pull the hammer out. We'll clean that up and we'll put it back in and give it another try. Okay, so I've got the hammer back out and I can see that there's still a slight lip there that I'm going to have to take out. So let's go ahead and get our files out and get to work. I'm going to select a file that's got a slight contour to it to match the slight contour that's already on the hammer, and we're going to start cleaning up to remove the rest of that scallop. So now I've switched to a rounded file to be able to get up here a little bit better and to smooth out that contour all the way back. So now I've got a wet piece of 1000 grit automotive sandpaper that I'm going to use in here to smooth out this section so that the disengage slides smoothly off the surface. I did go through while I was doing this and broke some of the edges to remove sharpness on these surfaces. That's mostly for my own well-being. Some of them can get kind of sharp as you're filing and smoothing things down. Sometimes it's difficult to try to get just the right angle in here to get the entire surface. I think that's pretty good. Let's give it a shot. So let's see how our trigger's working on this. You can see the trigger pull is working very effectively. Now, let's let the disengage catch. We'll let off the trigger extremely lightly to see if we can get it to hang up again. Okay. One more time. There's the disengage. This I let up extremely light and extremely slow. It is releasing the disengage and catching on the sear, so it looks like we're good there. Let's go ahead and catch it on the disengage one more time. So there it's caught on the disengage. I'm going to lighten up my trigger pull just slightly so that it's just hanging on the edge of the disengage. And I'm going to tap it a little bit to make sure that the disengage doesn't accidentally release the hammer. And it doesn't. Let's check one more time. There we go. So it looks like our trigger work here is done. we're going to go ahead and we're going to set this aside for our next rifle build. And that's it for just lightly reworking a stock trigger, especially with the Anderson trigger group that I've been using. It requires a little bit of work. Just pay attention, watch what you're doing, because the slightest change in geometry between those two components can have a lasting effect. If you change them too much, it could release the hammer when the trigger is not pulled. It could disengage before the trigger is at a point where the hammer will recatch on the sear. So remember, do your research, get informed, and get to work.